In 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed. Palestine was lost. 16 years later, in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was founded. Made up of different factions, the PLO has been at the heart of the struggle to regain Palestine ever since. With the prospect of a new order in the region, the PLO needed to shift emphasis from revolution to negotiation. But new political forces were making their presence felt within Palestinian society, threatening the role and relevancy of the PLO. Following the 1991 Gulf War, US President George Bush and his Secretary of State James Baker decided it was high time to resolve the problems in the Middle East. They devised a formula to bring a reluctant Israel to the negotiating table.
I think Bush was really annoyed, and he and Baker came up with this idea, which I thought was actually quite smart, and said, you can have the loans, but only if you agree to a complete freeze on settlements, because we are not going to subsidize policies in the West Bank that we oppose.
In the US Congress, Baker increased the pressure on the Israelis, goading them to call.
It's going to take some really good faith, affirmative effort on the part of our good friends in Israel. And if we don't get it, and if we can't get it quickly, I have to tell you, Mr. Levine, that everybody over there should know that the telephone number is 1-202-456-1414. When you're serious about peace, call us.
The American strategy worked, and Israeli and Arab delegations attended a peace conference in the Spanish capital Madrid in October 1991. Although PLO leader Yasser Arafat was not invited, he was well represented by Palestinian negotiators from Gaza and the West Bank. Arafat kept a tight rein on the Palestinian negotiators, and they made sure they towed the party line.
نحن شاركنا في افتتاح المؤتمر ولكن شاركنا بالمشاهدة على التلفزيون ولكن من أرض مدريد.
The speech delivered by Haider Abd al-Shafi in Madrid was written by Hanan Ashrawi and Nabil Chaath. Mamdouh Naufal and Akram Haniyeh contributed to it. But in the end it was faxed to Tunis, and we waited till morning until by return fax we got Arafat's blessing with notes and amendments in his handwriting. The Americans and the Spanish knew this.
After the Madrid conference, further negotiations continued in Washington. Away from the media spotlight, secret talks were also held between Israeli and Palestinian officials. In April 1992, a plane carrying Yasser Arafat crashed in the Libyan desert. Arafat survived, but the crash highlighted the lack of any clear successor to the Palestinian leader. The transition of power was becoming an increasingly important matter. In the Palestinian territories, Islamist factions, which were not members of the PLO, were steadily building a solid base of support. They were vocally opposed to the negotiations Arafat was conducting with Israel.
After failure of the secular system practice their ideas in Madrid, the people will shift voluntarily, without any force or violence, towards the Islamic movement.
Many Palestinians shared such views, unconvinced that negotiations with Israel would lead to a breakthrough. Aware of this skepticism, Arafat gave the go-ahead to a secret channel of talks in the Norwegian capital, Oslo.
Arafat's strategy was to open many channels and let many people try to achieve something. He keeps his windows open and awaits the incoming winds. The end result is what's important, not the person or persons delivering the goods.
On August 20th, 1993, Israeli and Palestinian negotiators reached accord in Oslo, agreeing to a framework for resolving their decades-long conflict. the Oslo Accords were announced to the world. Hamas was quick to condemn the accords. It was a first sign of a growing divide between Hamas and the PLO. On September 13, 1993, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO leader Yasser Arafat shook hands and sealed the deal at the White House.
The children of Abraham, the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, have embarked together on a bold journey. Together, today, with all our hearts and all our souls, we bid them shalom, salam, peace.
We who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today, in a loud and a clear voice, enough of blood and tears. Enough.
إن معركة السلام أيتها السيدات والسادة هي أصعب معارك حياتنا، وهي تستحق منا كل الجهود لأن أرض السلام تتوق للسلام العادل والشامل.
It was the first time the Israeli and Palestinian leaders had come face to face. Condemnation of the Oslo Accords spread like wildfire throughout the Arab world.
On this black day, the PLO betrays the blood of the martyrs who fell for their homeland. Today, the PLO has harmed beyond belief its own people and sold out their right in their homeland, Palestine. Today, the PLO recognizes Israel and acknowledges Israeli sovereignty over the whole of historical Palestine.
Notwithstanding these criticisms, the Oslo Accords found supporters in the Palestinians.
فيصل بعرفها منه شخصيا، قال لي إنه هو بادر إلى اقتراح.
Faisal Husseini, God rest his soul, used to say that he had reservations about the Oslo Accords, but he called it our child, and that it was better for us to defend Jerusalem from Ramallah next door than defend it from faraway Tunis.
But the peace process initiated by the Oslo Accords soon began to founder. On February 25, 1994, Baruch Goldstein, a Jewish extremist, opened fire on Palestinian worshippers in the main mosque of Hebron, killing 29 and wounding 150. Just weeks later, Hamas responded with 2 suicide bombings inside Israel, killing 15 civilians. Suicide attacks were to become a trademark tactic of Hamas. The mosque massacre and the suicide attacks did not preclude the signing of the Gaza-Jericho Agreement in May 1994, in which Israel agreed to undertake troop withdrawals from those areas. In July 1994, Arafat returned to Gaza. He received a hero's welcome. It was the first time in 27 years that the PLO leader returned to the homeland he had devoted his life to regaining. The return heralded the establishment of the Palestinian National Authority, or PNA, set up to fulfill the terms of the Oslo Accords and administer the Palestinian territories. But Arafat found it difficult to make the transition from the leader of a liberation movement to the builder of a nation.
الأخ أبو عمار بنى سلطة تقوم على قاعدة شمولية توتاليتارية.
Chairman Arafat built his authority on a totalitarian basis. The criteria for admission to the instruments of state was contingent upon being a member of his Fatah movement and recommendation of one of his security apparatus. It was single-party rule with no accountability.
As Arafat tried to build the foundations of state, he also needed to continue negotiations. Final status issues such as the status of Jerusalem, security, borders, and refugees remained unresolved. But the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, maintained a hardline negotiating stance. It did not endear him to US President Bill Clinton.
Well, initially, I mean, he actually said after this first set of meetings when Netanyahu came, he left the room and he said, "Who does he think the superpower is? He is and we're not."
Final status issues came back on the negotiating table following the election of Ehud Barak as Israeli Prime Minister in 1999. Barak quickly gained the ear of the US President.
And Barak's logic is, what do I need and what do I want? I want to get to a final status agreement with the Palestinians by the time you, President Clinton, leave office. That's what he tells him in August '99 when he visits him.
Barak's offer was for Israel to withdraw from much of the West Bank while keeping sovereignty over key parts of Jerusalem. In 2000, he convinced Clinton of the need to convene a meeting with Arafat in the United States to resolve the final issues.
One, and he couldn't say no to the president. He came with a profound suspicion and resentment. Suspicion that the Americans and the Israelis were going to present him with a fait accompli that he couldn't accept, and resentment at Ehud Barak, who he believed had chased the Israeli-Syrian negotiation for the preceding 7 months, ignoring him and Israel's commitments, and who was prepared to give to Assad 99.9% of the Golan Heights, minus 400 yards off the northeastern portion of the lake. And yet, Mr. Barak's offer to Arafat at Camp David was 90%.
Barak refused to meet alone with Arafat at Camp David.
Now at Camp David, Barak took this position, I don't want to meet alone with Arafat. I don't want to build that kind of personal connection because, again, once I'm with Arafat alone, he will write down everything, and Barak would say, Arafat always has this notepad, and he writes down everything that people say. He'll keep it in his pocket, and one day he'll come out and say, Barak has agreed to divide Jerusalem, and so I can't accept that.
كيف تريد من عرفات أن يذهب إلى كامب ديفيد وأن ينهي النزاع هناك?
How do you want Arafat to go to Camp David and end the conflict without getting a written offer from Barak? I'm certain that if he had been presented with a written offer, he would have asked to have had it initialed and put it in his pocket. I'm certain of that.
Before agreeing to attend the Camp David summit, Arafat sought assurances that he would not be made a scapegoat if the talks failed. Arafat rejected Barak's proposals at Camp David. He concluded the Palestinian state envisaged would not be viable, made up of cantons and completely surrounded by territory to be annexed to Israel.
And then what does Clinton do? He breaks his promise and blames Arafat for the failure of Camp David. So Arafat is made out to be a liar. That's plain shameful.
Much of the Western media criticized Arafat at the time for rejecting the proposals. But today, former US administration officials acknowledge that Arafat had little choice.
What was presented at Camp David, I think, if you ask any American negotiator today, any of us, do we think the Palestinians could have accepted the ideas that could have accepted the ideas that President Clinton put on the table or already briefed Arafat on in July 2000? I think they would all say, they would have to say in hindsight, no. He couldn't accept them. Couldn't accept them because there was no way he could defend a 9-to-1 swap. There's no way he could accept Israeli sovereignty over the Haram. There's no way he could accept this patchwork of sovereignty over Jerusalem, etc., etc. In fact, the proof of the matter is the Palestinian leaders who today are lauded as the most moderate, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, etc., Yasser Abed Rabo, they all rejected what was on the table or not on the table at Camp David in terms that were even more harsh than Arafat himself. They were adamantly against them. So that tells you something about whether these were the kind of proposals that a Palestinian could accept.
Should he have taken the deal at Camp David? Probably not.
A last-ditch attempt by Clinton at the end of his presidency failed to produce an agreement, and Arafat was blamed.
I blame it partly on Clinton and Dennis. They told the incoming administration, Bush and Cheney, literally on Inauguration Day, that Arafat was totally responsible for the failure of the peace process, and that he was a liar and you couldn't count on him, you shouldn't deal with him.
After the meeting at Camp David, Arafat returned to Gaza and received a hero's welcome for refusing to accept what the Palestinians viewed as unacceptable. He was by now, however, a pariah in Washington, unwelcome and untrusted. Just weeks later, the Second Intifada erupted, triggered by Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount, or Noble Sanctuary, in Jerusalem. The Palestinians had lost hope with the diplomatic approach. Amid the death and violence of the new Intifada, Hamas increased its role and its power base in the occupied territories. In Israel, Barak lost the elections to the leader of the Israeli opposition, Arafat's old arch-rival Ariel Sharon. Sharon was in no mood for concession, and following the September 11th attacks on the United States, he was quick to spot an opportunity to get the Americans more on his side.
September 11 allowed Sharon to gain sympathy for Israel's internal security situation. In effect, what he was saying was that what you in America faced on September 11, I face on a daily basis. And Sharon was able to convince the world that Yasser Arafat was the source of terrorism.
Israeli military actions that killed children, women, and the elderly caused Palestinian reactions to be emotional instead of political, and therefore revenge became the source of justice for the weak. The Israelis knew this, I believe. The crushing of the Palestinians' political backbone is one of the great achievements of the Israeli army during the Intifada. So in other words, there was chaos.
In the spring of 2002, Ariel Sharon decided to hold Yasser Arafat personally responsible for every act of violence perpetrated against Israel. Israeli forces quickly surrounded Arafat's headquarters in Ramallah and set out to systematically destroy all the instruments of Palestinian state infrastructure. Besieged and with few remaining allies, Arafat turned down an offer from Sharon to depart. He feared he would not be allowed to return. Instead, Arafat announced that he would fight to the very end. Under pressure, Arafat devolved some of his powers to the newly appointed Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas, also known as Abu Mazen. But in Arafat's eyes, Abbas proved ineffective.
I was with Arafat when Prime Minister Abbas was in Washington, and Arafat received a phone call telling him it was no good. The White House had not agreed to him regaining his freedom. At that point, Arafat said, if the Americans refuse to grant Abbas the freedom of Yasser Arafat, the democratically elected president of the Palestinian people, does he think they will give him the rights of the Palestinian people in Jerusalem and borders and the issue of refugees? They will not. Arafat subsequently quickly moved to engineer the fall of Abu Mazen's cabinet, and he did.
Surrounded in his Ramallah headquarters, Arafat held out until October of 2004, when he was struck down by a mysterious illness. Israel said it would allow him to seek treatment abroad and return. Arafat died in a Paris hospital, cause unknown. The Palestinians claimed he was poisoned. The Israelis protested their innocence.
interested in what we are going to say about former President Arafat. He was an icon in the proper sense of the word. He was not only concerned with the liberation of the Arab people, but of all the oppressed people throughout the world, Arabs and non-Arabs. And to lose a man of that stature and thinking is a great blow to all those who are fighting against oppression. We regret that, and we give our condolences to his family and to the Arab people to which he belonged.
What a shameful thing, the way the world stood by and watched while Arafat was treated that way in the last years of his life. It's absolutely shameful.
Following Arafat's death, Mahmoud Abbas was elected president of the Palestinian Authority. But he lacked the power base and hold over Palestinian politics that Arafat had established. Abbas soon faced a challenge to his authority from Hamas, the Islamic movement, which now commanded the loyalty of a large proportion of Palestinians. In January 2006, Hamas defeated the Fatah movement of Abbas in parliamentary elections. A power struggle ensued between the Palestinian Authority led by Abbas and Hamas. Gun battles broke out between Fatah and Hamas gunmen. In the summer of 2007, Hamas fighters captured the Fatah headquarters in Gaza, securing control of the area. Gaza became the confirmed stronghold of Hamas. Fatah had been supplanted.
Would Arafat have lost control of Gaza the way Abu Mazen did?
It's hard to believe that he would have, for one simple reason. Arafat was an icon. He lost a lot of support among Palestinians. I felt it, even as time went by. But he was an icon because he put the Palestinian issue on the international map. He established for the international community a sense that somehow what he identified as Palestinian national aspirations had to be achieved. So he put the Palestinian movement on the world stage, and he also unified the Palestinians in a way that no other leader had.
I think what's happened since he has died should tell us something about how central he was to the Palestinian map. And you know, it is ironic that even some of those who were most critical of Arafat among Palestinians during his final days are the most eager to rally behind his name and his picture and his flag today.
Today, the Palestine Liberation Organization is no longer the force it once was. The emergence of new groups such as Hamas has eroded support for the traditional PLO. Rather than being a unifying force, the PLO is now a protagonist in inter-Palestinian discord. The revolution, started over 40 years ago, may have faded, but the dreams of the Palestinians for statehood live on, as strong as ever.